We're ready to start today's event. Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you to the webinar on experimentalism and sociology. I'll be moderating today's discussion. My name is Shinjini Chatterjee and I'm Senior Publishing Editor for Springer's Sociology and Anthropology program. I've been in academic publishing for 20 years and I'm a sociologist by training. Today's talk takes off from a recently published book by the same name by Tanja Bogusz, Experimentalism and Sociology, From Crisis to Experience. Springer is proud to have been on this publishing journey with Dr. Bogusz leading up to today's discussion. And we'd also like to thank Hamburg University's Center for Sustainable Society Research, which provided immense help in promoting this event. We are honored and delighted to have our esteemed discussants on board with us, each bringing their unique and complementary perspectives to the topic at hand. I keenly look forward to new learnings from the discussions ahead. We've divided today's discussion into two parts. The first, providing brief insights into sociological experimentalism, and the second, more interactive session, engaging in deeper discussions on the topic. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end for audience questions, but please feel free to add your questions in the chat box during the talk. If possible, please mention the person for whom your question is directed. In order to avoid background noise, I request everyone to be on mute throughout the talk. For those who couldn't join us now, the recording will be available in a couple of days at the event link and will be sent to all registered participants. Hamburg University will also upload the recording on their YouTube channel. And now I request Dr. Bogusz to introduce the book. A few words about Tanja first. Dr. Bogusz is a sociologist and social anthropologist at the Center for Sustainable Society Research at Hamburg University. She has published broadly on French sociology and anthropology, pragmatism and practice theories, social sciences of nature, and sociological experimentalism. She has had various visiting professorships in France and Germany and has been a research fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge in New York University. She's earned several grants for research projects at the crossroads of social theory, human-environmental relations, biodiversity research, and social cohesion. I now invite Tanja to speak on the book. Over to you, Tanja.
Thank you very much, Shinjini. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me to have this public conversation today and to share my thoughts on sociological experimentalism with Hans-Jörg, Rheinberger, Noortje and Karin Knorr Cetina. I start my pitch with a question. Has society again become a real-world laboratory? And if yes, what kind of laboratory are we in, or are we co-producing as members of society? The society as a laboratory topos has a long and complex tradition in sociology. Like the experiment, it could stand for threat, crisis, as well as for creativity, innovation, and civic participation, as, for instance, socio-ecological real laboratories aiming for democratic solutions for sustainable futures. The idea to turn to what I call sociological experimentalism is based on the idea of tracing the real laboratory topos back to its epistemic foundations. And this brought me to the study of pragmatism. Pragmatism is a social philosophy of epistemic empowerment, ready to develop tools to understand not only the making of social critique, one of the core topics for sociology as a discipline, but also to capture the baselines for social cohesion and civic support. Sociologists have proven to be excellent in the analysis of social inequalities and disparities, but we are not so well equipped regarding systematic knowledge considering the structural preconditions for what holds societies together, that is, taking up Richard Sennett's concept of cooperation, successful cooperation in between heterogeneous actors. Someone has muted his microphone. You can hear ringing somewhere. So maybe everyone could mute, that would be nice. So taking up Richard Sennett's concept of cooperation means successful cooperation in between heterogeneous actors, actors who are different socially and culturally and epistemically. Facing the multiple crises of our times, social, geopolitical, and above all, ecological, such systematic knowledge about these kinds of cooperations is urgently needed. From French neo-pragmatism established by Luc Boltanski and Laurent Thévenot, I took the assumption that it's the actors themselves who dispose on the potential capacities to produce social change. Their pragmatic sociology of critique helped me to profile not only a more general idea of social dynamics, but in particular to link their pragmatic approach to other strands that framed later on also my empirical research domains, science and technology studies, STS, and the anthropology of nature. Interconnecting pragmatism and STS turned out to be not only a fascinating enterprise, but even more than obvious reading through John Dewey's experimental theory of knowledge. As the works of all three distinguished panelists here have shown, there is a deep historical as well as epistemic kinship between modes of reasoning within classic scientific experimentation and what Charles Peirce called pragmatic laboratory thinking. However, despite this kinship, STS still remains reluctant vis-à-vis social theory as a means in itself. Yet by focusing on the experimentalist part of pragmatism, I saw a possibility not only to create a most dynamic yet productive theoretical framework, but also to reconcile anthropology with sociology. This reconciliation went hand in hand with an insight that closed the circle to the former question of social cohesion. If sociology would become an expert for the preconditions of cooperation and empowerment, experience matters. As it happens, anthropology, unlike sociology, is the science of actors' experiences. The colonial experience, discussed through the writing culture debate in the 1980s and post-colonial theory, have transformed anthropology's concept of modernity fundamentally. A transformation sociology is still undergoing. Moreover, anthropology started to rethink the ontological divide between nature and culture as concepts through a critical social ecology long before the Anthropocene debate became prominent within the social sciences. However, a clear-cut definition of experience as a generator of knowledge is missing, both in anthropology and in sociology. So to sum up, my book explores three challenges. First, the lack of knowledge on the epistemic contribution of experience to social theory and analysis. Second, the lack of knowledge on the preconditions of social cohesion and progress. And third, the lack of knowledge on the methodological baselines to overcome the front lines between the natural and the social sciences in the Anthropocene. The book traces back the experimentalist approach in a number of sociological and related programs: early Chicago School, early Bourdieu, laboratory studies, practice theories, STS and A&T, as well as system theory, the pragmatic sociology of critique, and the anthropology of nature I mentioned already. I assembled them related to their specific analytical characteristics to profile a genuine methodological framework that can be taken, modified, and transformed within further empirical inquiries. To put it in a nutshell, experimentalism following Dewey means experiential-based transformation from ignorance into knowledge through operational action. And this can happen inside and outside the laboratory, of course. Experimentalism is thus understood as constantly two-folded. It is simultaneously object of inquiry and methodological tool for inquiry, especially sociologist inquiry in my conception. Having said that, I'd conclude my pitch by coming back to the question if society has become again a real laboratory. Instead of giving an answer, I would reframe the question. Perhaps more important than to define society as a phenomenon of experimental character, is it to explore in which sense the experimental approach helps us not only to better understand current social transformation, but especially to carve out the epistemic as well as the methodological consequences of the laboratorization of society, or what do we call democratic experimentalism. My assumption is that sociology as a discipline could become more human and more collaborative by transforming from a science of crisis towards an experimental science of experience. Such a sociology prefers to focus on the development of expertise on the preconditions of heterogeneous collaboration within and beyond the sciences. So the laboratory is not just out there. Rather, it might be our task to establish and make available real laboratories as spaces for future experimentation, aiming for long-term collaborations between heterogeneous livelihoods, human as well as non-human. So this was my short pitch on the book. Thanks a lot for listening. And now I'm very much looking forward to your critical feedback and comments.
Thank you, Tanja, for this excellent overview of the book. We will now start the first warm-up session with the speakers. Today's speakers hardly need any introduction, and it's impossible to summarize their achievements in minutes, but I will try. The first speaker today is Professor Hans-Jörg Rheinberger. Professor Rheinberger is Director Emeritus at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. He has trained in philosophy, linguistics, and biology. In his long-spanning career, he has held various academic positions in universities in Berlin, Stanford, Lübeck, and Salzburg. From 1997 to 2014, he was director at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. Within the history of science, his main areas of work are the history and epistemology of experiments, as well as the history of molecular biology and protein biosynthesis. Our second speaker is Professor Karin Knorr Cetina. Professor Knorr Cetina is Obershare Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. She's a sociologist and philosopher of science and has significantly influenced the theory of praxeology. Professor Knorr Cetina was a professor at the University of Bielefeld until 2001, and then at Konstanz until 2010. She's interested in financial markets, knowledge and information, as well as in globalization, theory, and culture. She studies globalization from a microsociological perspective using an ethnographic approach and continues to be interested in laboratory studies, which is the study of science, technology, and information at the site of knowledge production, particularly in the life sciences and in particle physics. Our last speaker today is Professor Noortje. Professor Maris is trained in the sociology and philosophy of science and technology. She has conducted research on emergent forms of public engagement in technological societies and in work on sustainable living and related practices of material participation, such as everyday carbon accounting. Her current research focuses on experiments beyond the laboratory, examining diverse forms of testing in societal settings, like street trials of intelligent vehicles, fact checks in media environments, and COVID testing situations, as critical interfaces between science, engineering, nature, and society. Much of her work is therefore concerned with experiments in society as forms of knowledge, intervention, and engagement. I now invite the speakers to tell us what they think of sociological experimentalism in terms of their own research work and perspectives. Tanja Bogusz will comment at the end. Professor Rheinberger, could I request you to start, please? Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, experience is a complicated term. Maybe we can come back to this point a little bit later. So what I would like to do in these brief minutes is to describe the perspective on experimentation from which my own work proceeds. And this, of course, very briefly, so that we afterwards have the possibility to for comparative action. Now, I think scientific activity, and that's what my work is about, is first and foremost a form of practical activity, but it is an activity that has a specific aim. And we never have to forget that it aims at knowledge production. So experimental activity itself, then, and that would be the second point, is a special form of scientific activity more generally, but one that certainly has proved of particular efficiency in what we call the natural sciences, to the extent that it can be regarded as, today at least, as the core of the scientific research process. Whether this will remain so forever, we do not know. And we should also not forget that this does not mean that other forms of scientific activity have completely disappeared. No, they have not. There continues to be observation, there continues to be collecting activities, there continue to be classification activities, to name just a few. And all of them, broadly speaking, can be, of course, subsumed under the term scientific knowledge production. Moreover, experimentation in the sciences has to be seen, and that is for me possibly the most important point, as an ongoing process, a question-generating machinery rather than a problem-solving one. Problem-solving is only one aspect of experimentation, and probably not even the most important one. It centers, problem-solving centers around what Robert Merton once called specific ignorance. That is, lack of knowledge that you can pin down. The real core of the scientific research process, however, revolves around revealing an ignorance of which we did not know, which we could not specify before. So it helps to reveal epistemic things that we were unable to anticipate. Now the question is, does this imply that our own efforts to understand the scientific research process, so I'm talking about my profession, which I address as historical epistemology, must also be of an experimental character? That's a question. My personal answer would be, it must. But we have to be aware that this does by no means imply that the experimental ways in which historical epistemology engages with its object, the historicity of the sciences, have to be of the same character. This basically means that in the last instance, the form that experimentation must take in various contexts is determined by the specificities of its objects. Ceteris paribus, I guess this also holds for society as an object of science. It is thus to expect that experimentation in the social sciences takes other forms than in the natural sciences. But it is the essential feature or gesture, that there is one essential feature or gesture that remains, namely to be exploratory in the sense that it is about gaining unprecedented knowledge of its object, that is, of society. There is a wonderful quote of Dewey in this respect that Tanja quotes on page 51 of her book. I quote it here. In scientific inquiry, the criterion of what is taken to be settled, or to be knowledge for that matter, is being so settled that it is available as a resource in further inquiry, not being settled in such a way as not to be subject to revision in further inquiry. So it's a double negation here, but I think it is perfectly understandable what Dewey means. So that's my input.
Thank you, Professor Rheinberger. And now Professor Knorr Cetina, please.
Oh, I have to unmute myself, so hopefully you can understand me and hear me. I have to say, I want to start a little differently in the sense that I was a little puzzled by the organizing concept of the book, which is experimentalism and experience to a degree, because first of all, the other side of non-experience wasn't specified, what that exactly means, where that is, and that would be a question to Tanja. But also, of course, because I also belong to those who hadn't read Dewey in relation to what he meant by these things. And I am grateful to Tanja for working some of these things out. Even so, and even as she did in chapter 2 in particular, but throughout the book, the idea of this experimentalism remains for me a somewhat fuzzy concept, or perhaps one should say a very general concept. With the subcategories of experience, test and cooperation and so on, don't necessarily articulate the concept itself further, but need their own further explanation. So for me, certainly the explications Dewey gave and Tanja gave following the pragmatists do not come across to me as a coherent, where you have an aha-erlebnis in the sense of now I know what we all have been doing or what we should be doing, because it is infused with, on the one hand, political, even moral considerations. On the other hand, it has connotations with doing experiments, which of course not many of us in the social sciences really actually do. However, the concept grew on me as I read the book, and I think it's genuinely Tanja Bogusz's contribution to the philosophy of the social sciences and methodology of the social sciences to inject, this particular interpretation she produces in the book, and to link it to particular examples with which I would not automatically have thought the laboratory studies have much in common. For example, Bourdieu or Descola. There is really a genuinely new approach, I think, that Tanja is proposing. And it's one that warrants our interest and warrants our attention. I want to explain a little further why, where this puzzling element comes from. Then we turned to the laboratory as sort of the immediate connotation. When you think about science and they do research, the question is how and where, and then the laboratory shows up in many sciences, not in all, but in many sciences, the laboratory is there. When we did that, we had our own theoretical motivations, partly reinforced and partly also discovered in doing the laboratory studies. And these motivations were directed against the field of science studies as it existed before. There was an elaborate history of science, there was an elaborate philosophy of science. There was not as elaborate, but a substantial sociology of science before the turn to the epistemic practices. And the problem was that all of these areas seemed to mostly ignore the practices. Philosophy, because it had the notion of the context of justification was its main topic and not the context of discovery. So it distincted it out of the realm of philosophical inquiry. History, because it was focused on the history of ideas. And the question was, to some degree, what are these people doing in the first place? You know, are they thinking aloud? Are they doing history of ideas, or are they doing something else? And sociology, because it explicitly thought that we should not look at the epistemic side of science, because we would nothing find there as sociologists that was of interest. It wasn't our area of competence. It was physics or biology or whatever they were doing. It was a professional, technical thing about which sociologists couldn't say anything. And so this embeddedness of fields that emerge, of studies that emerge. Think of Bourdieu. His Algeria study was directed against particularly logical structuralism that had dominated especially French sociology with Lévi-Strauss and others before. So this embeddedness in a disciplinary sequence of programs and processes completely ignored. I think it was, it turned out, certainly for laboratory studies, to imply a fight. That was actually undertaken at conferences with philosophers and sociologists of the new kind of science studies being at each other's throat. And even with the old sociology of science, an enmity being an enmity turned up that nobody intended personally, I think, but structurally. We found ourselves as enemies of previous sociologists, and they saw us as enemies of previous. So this embeddedness in fields that are past dependent and go in a particular direction but change all the time should not be forgotten. It is sort of a larger contextuality for what certain fields do. The other thing I wanted to say in this regard has to do with the notion ethnography, because the notion ethnography comes up quite often in the book, and in practice, what we did in science studies and what you meant very often when you pointed to other authors and what they had done was what we would technically call ethnography. But of course, there's a lot of internal differentiation of ethnography. So it's not automatically explicative of things either. There is in anthropology a very interesting sort of ethnography, which means you have to expose yourself. You have to try and absorb a different culture. It means going there and hanging out there. It does not mean reading a methodology book ahead of time. So I was puzzled by my Chicago colleagues in anthropology. I should say I'm also part of the anthropology department. And when I tried to offer an ethnography course that read technically what methodologists had to say about ethnography and how to do it, then they didn't like that. They wanted to read some old ethnography books, but they did not want to have a technical explication of what ethnography entails. So sociology is quite different. It looks at these technical explications and follows it. It knows that it has to use grounded theory in order to analyze the data, and grounded theory is a technical elaboration, including sampling, how to theorize, all kinds of things. So, and the third kind of anthropology, a third kind of ethnography, I think links, and maybe that would be another question to Tanja, links this doing more to the body of the ethnographer. The ethnographer, by being somewhere, has a lot of data raining in on her or him. And these data are being processed, but not explicitly processed from day one, not necessarily explicitly processed. It took me sometimes an embarrassing number of years, sometimes in my studies of finance, until I discovered that I had to take the screens serious that was there on the trading floors all over from day one. It took me 2 years. It is an implicit processing, but not an explicit analysis or an explicit sort of observation that observes the right thing. And the instrument of the observer is quite important. The embodied instrument of the observer is quite important. So this was more an attempt to explicate why I was a little thrown out of my knowledge area in this by the notion experimentalism. But I think it adds what my colleague Hans-Jörg Rheinberger already suggested. It adds these qualities that you find in scientific real experiments very often, that you find there. It adds them and shows us that they are also there in sociology, were also there when the Chicago School went into the lab. And they were there, certainly when I went into the lab, I was a non-believer in laboratory studies. I thought this was nonsense because after all, scientists think. So what would I observe? What am I doing here? Why am I doing that? And it resulted in my I completely got hooked the first day I observed the laboratory, because I saw an action system and I knew this was not only observable, this was very dynamic and a process that changed all the time in front of my eyes. And so you got hooked by reality, but I did not believe in it in the beginning. So it had this experimental character from day one that Hans-Jörg already pointed to. I think I will leave it with that. I have a number of other things, but we can come back later.
Thank you very much, Professor Knorr Cetina. And now the same question goes to you, Professor Maris.
Yes, thank you for the invitation, Tanja, to speak here. And I've indeed structured my comments around this difficult, but for me tantalizing question: what is sociological experimentalism? Tanja's book, which is very rich and very thorough, gives several answers to this question. And what I would like to do in my contribution is identify 3 answers from the many she gives, 3 that are to me the most important. So first of all, for Bogusz, to adopt an experimental approach in sociology means to recognize that we can only understand knowledge if we consider the change that it seeks in the world. The change that it seeks in the world. That is, for Bogusz, experimentation must be understood in terms of an activist orientation in knowledge. Now, in approaching experimentalism in this way, she adopts a distinctively pragmatist understanding of the experiment, one in which knowledge must always be understood in relation to the situations from which it arises and to which it responds. She includes a beautiful quote from Dewey, which says, knowledge must be understood as a call for thought from a situation, and it is the call to do away with some evil. Now, I think it is this activist orientation that enables Bogusz to broaden the scene of experimentation and of experiments. For her, experimentation is not only about the scientific method, it is about the experience of the world and of society. As she puts it right on page 1, knowledge is rooted in experiences that arise from crisis. So, to sum up this first meaning, as I take it from her text, from her book, experiments unfold on the plane of experience. They are more than knowledge derived from controlled conditions. That also means that for Bogusz, experimentation cannot be understood in terms of the places and the specific practices in terms of which science practices experiments, which was one of the founding propositions, I think, in laboratory studies, and a hugely enabling one there. Rather, in this broad understanding of experiment, it includes all that knowledge that arises from the destabilization of our world and the response this necessitates, the necessity to change the conditions in and of the world. Now, what makes Tanja's book very complicated and also, I think, very provocative in the sense of provoking response is that she also gives a very different definition of sociological experimentalism. This is the one that I think she especially foregrounded in her introduction today, where she states that sociology today must undertake an inquiry into the transformation of our world into a space of experimentation. So she uses here the phrase society as laboratory. And what is challenging, but I think appropriate, is that this transformation of the world into a space of experimentation, according to Bogusz, operates on several different levels. So there's on the one hand, the rise of real-world experimentation as a paradigm in technoscience, where the the material and social technical transformation of environments in society so as to enable experimentation within those environments it's an emergent paradigm of technoscience that requires sociological study in Bogusz's account. But she also speaks, or rather writes, and I hope today she will speak, of a second way in which society is transformed into a space of experimentation. And here she refers to sort of fundamental transformations. She speaks of the ecological crisis. She speaks of the accidents that are associated with the rise of the risk society. She discusses in several passages the Chernobyl disaster. And here we find a second experimentalization, I think, of the world on an ontological level, where there is a profound destabilization of the conditions of everyday living in societies marked by the invention of technoscience. And so I read much of the book as a struggle, and I mean that in the positive sense, with this double kind of experimentalization of life in society, that life in society becomes testing in these two senses. On the one hand, life unfolds in spaces that have been modified to enable real-world experimentation as a techno-scientific methodology. And second, social life has become testing in a sense that we live under conditions, which in Britain are increasingly called the poly crisis. So yeah, this, I think one of the things would be interesting to discuss is the extent to which it's even possible to talk about experimentation as somehow occurring across these levels, and what that would require from sociology, whether that's possible and whether it's advisable for sociology to attempt that. But I'll just mention a third and last meaning of sociological experimentalism that to me is relevant. And here I will be referring back to the question that Hans-Jörg Rheinberger raised around experimental method in different disciplines and fields, and the extent to which the specificity of the object of study, how that inflects the experimental mode of inquiry. Because in Bogusz's book, there are two propositions that can be found that to me stand in tension. So the first is that Bogusz very strongly distinguishes sociological experimentalism from other kinds of experimentalism. So for sociologists to engage in an experimental inquiry, for her, she says, it involves reflexivity. So there is a reflexive engagement with social actors trying to understand society themselves and actors who experiment in society themselves. It is participatory, it is critical. She also indicates that this sociological experimental way of doing inquiry is collaborative, it's testing, it's exploratory. Now, many of these terms for me are not compatible with many of the articulations of experimental method in technosciences, in technoscientific fields, where experimentation is much more closely associated with the creation of controlled conditions, associated with creating conditions under which stability is possible. So the stabilization of a dispositif of observation. Now, so this, and now I'm going to try and wrap up. This for me would indicate that sociological experimentalism and other kinds of scientific experimentalism would be quite different. And indeed, that sociology at some times would need to fight its corner for the type of experimentalism that it practices as distinct from that practiced in other fields. Yet Bogusz in her book is quite insistent that we should not be sociological critics of the natural sciences, that we should, and this would be my question, always prioritize our alignments over our antagonism when it comes to our relation to the natural sciences. I think it's clear in how I speak that I'm searching for the formulation here, but I would be, I would very much like it if Tanja would clarify her approach on that last point as well. So thank you.
Intriguing comments, and as we are so what I try to do in really very short time, so we will have the opportunity to discuss a bit more with more time in the second part of the session. I try to sum up a bit and maybe also to integrate some of the comments and questions and critiques which came up from the three panelists. So by listening to all the three of you, sometimes I had the impression that maybe Hans-Jörg Rheinberger gave a sort of answer to a question which was raised by Karin Knorr Cetina or Noortje or vice versa. So, but I will try to comment on some of your comments. So Hans-Jörg Rheinberger stressed in the beginning of his comment very rightly the idea of the experimental approach as a question generating machine, and this is something which I find really very important, and which from which I could also make a link to Noortje's last comment, because if the idea of the experiment is, so we might ask indeed what Noortje asked in the end of her comment, if scientific experimentation, as we know it from, especially from technosciences and from what also especially Karin Knorr Cetina and others have observed during laboratory studies, that scientific experimentation understood in the positivist manner, in a positivist approach, was or might be notably the idea of solving a problem, and solving a problem then means to establish a device through which open questions through hypotheses will be tested again and again until the question is, so to speak, solved. And indeed, I share absolutely the idea of Hans-Jörg Rheinberger, which is that the experiment, and I think laboratory studies have exactly proven through their embodied perception of the practice of laboratory experiments, that knowledge is something which is created through ignorance and through, as you said, Noortje, through crisis situations. And the crisis situation could then be, of course, something which occurs during modes of reflection, during research on a research vessel on the oceans, or during taxonomists' inquiry in particular fields. So the idea to understand experimentalist practices as settling and exploring question-generating machineries, to me was indeed, so to speak, the idée directrice of what I consider to be the experimental approach. And therefore, to me, it's not in the first place a contradiction to think about scientific practices as realized in the laboratory and sociological inquiry as something which should be, in my point of view, much more directed towards the idea that that we should inquire into things where maybe even the question is not completely settled at the first place. So that's the idea, of course, which was so nicely explained or expressed by the idea of Marilyn Strathern, saying that ethnography is a device to explore, to find things we haven't looked for. So so that could be one definition of the experiment, and as Noortje said rightly, of course, broad parts of especially technoscience wouldn't agree with this kind of definition, and they would completely oppose to this kind of idea that it's about inquiry into the unknown. It's that it could be comprehended as the contrary. But yeah, so to me, and maybe then I could take up some of the puzzles Karin Knorr Cetina was raising when talking about on the one hand on the question of the importance of ethnographic knowledge during within the framework of experimentalism, sociological experimentalism, and also the question of the role of experience within this kind of approach. So why I stress so much on the idea that the inquiry into the unknown is quite important for contemporary sociology. This is a result of the observation that, to my impression, the problems we find out there, actually, like the ecological crisis and many other crises, they produce a sort of ignorance, or they are also the result of ignorance, which sociology in many perspectives has not really fully embraced. So, to my understanding, when we look, for instance, at the question of the nature-culture or nature-society divide, and the question of how society is deeply entangled with nature, and how modernity has so long ignored this kind of entanglement, whereas anthropology knew much more about that a long time before. This is just one example amongst many others, where what I understand from the experimental approach is a much more humble and modest perspective on what we as sociologists have acknowledged until today. And therefore, the tension between different modes of experimentalism, either reflexive or, let's say, deterministic, stops to be a problem, because when we work together with natural scientists who have sometimes different ideas of what an experiment is, then also we might, as it was the case in my own study with marine taxonomists, for instance, discover reflexivities within this kind of experimental approach towards nature, which we as sociologists haven't expected at all. And I think that this kind of approach could help to figure out modes of knowledge, either naturalists or sociologists, that still wait to be discovered, so to speak. So that would be my first answer to your really very rich and complex comments, and I thank you already, all the three of you, for these. So maybe we could then go to the next part of the session.
Thank you, Tanja. I think we can just directly begin with the questions that you wanted to start with.
Okay, I make the beginning. Is that okay? I think I'm very sympathetic to the kind of focus that you're developing in your book, and in particular also, and there you can base yourself also on your own experience, is the kind of overcoming social crisis that we experience today in a sort of multifaceted collaboration between natural scientists, social scientists, and what have you, many more technicians and what have you, and of course, in the end, also the public. But on the other hand, I think we should not forget that we are living in a society of permanent crisis since about 300 years. And of course, the quality of this crisis over time was changing all the time. And at the same time, it was a period in which the sciences as we know them today only established themselves. They did also not pre-exist. They established themselves in precisely this context of permanent change. And I think one of the points of the ideology that is still behind so-called scientific thinking today, and that has to be, in the end, has to be overcome, is that the sciences are about the things that remain invariant. There we can have firm ground under our feet. And the natural sciences did this in the course of the 19th century by developing themselves in many different fields and establishing their own methodologies, and by subdividing into disciplines. This and also the big divides were established in the 19th century. Namely, there was another part of the academy which decided not to be scientists, not to be natural scientists. They called themselves Geisteswissenschaftler, and they claimed to have their own methodology, that basically they were able to do their business without regarding what the others were doing. And there was a substantial part of the development of the sciences where they came to sit in between, in particular sociology from its foundation in the second half of the 19th century, and psychology. They always kind of oscillated between the different camps. And so I think this kind of the paradigm of disciplination, of disciplinary divisions and subdivisions, that is something that in one way or the other, whether we want it or not, is coming to an end. And we are in a situation where we have to find new collaboration, new forms of collaboration. Also the sciences, and the sciences also have to get away from their paradigmatic thing. They find the invariance of nature. What the sciences, physics, chemistry, and all these other biology are doing now is to find the variances, to understand the ways in which these objects, be they living objects, be they chemical or physical objects, by means of which they change over time, and to understand this change. And I think this is a constellation that, of course, needs new approaches, needs maybe a radically different understanding of what the sciences are about at all. And it's a lot of big questions that we are faced with, of course, and which you also cannot completely answer in your book, but in one way or the other you address them. And the only critique that I would have, I absolutely do not like the term experimentalism. So I would suggest try to drop it from your discourse and invent another term. because it's so much is so much reminiscence from all these isms that we have had over a period of 150 years. That would be a very minor suggestion of from my side. So, okay.
So if I can jump into the discussion, because it connects to some degree to what Hans-Jörg just said, is some of these issues are resolved in practice in the ongoing changes in societies and nature and knowledge and technology. And certainly one thing one has to say is that the term experimentation also has differentiated into different kinds. So you, for example, in a randomized controlled trial, you are not necessarily attempting to determine or find something new. You're trying to find out whether an intervention had an effect or not. It's a very limited question you ask, but it's very time-consuming and an elaborate experiment to actually do these things and come to conclusions. So there are experiments which are not directed at openness. But the other thing I wanted to say on what's going on in society and science and collaboration, when I did the epistemic culture study, I did speak to physicists and molecular biologists, and to some degree, and sometimes I told them each other's stories, and they were hardly interested. It was really silos. It was separate sciences that had been separate not only for decades, but sometimes for centuries, and they behaved accordingly. They had their beliefs, and their beliefs were what they believed in, and another science was not going to teach them something else. However, what you observe now in relation to a particular kind of relatively new, nothing is ever new, but relatively new massive event, the influx of AI, artificial intelligence, into the sciences themselves, is suddenly in papers, and I was surprised myself by that, collaborations across discipline in relation, for example, machine learning, or certain algorithms are being used by this discipline and that discipline, and papers are being produced, white papers as to what they should be doing, and grant applications are co-produced by physicists and chemists and maybe biologists and information scientists. And it's a surprising event that happens in the sciences. And the collaboration, maybe we would have to, even if we don't like it, take into account in sociology, is the collaboration with synthetic actors, with what artificial intelligence produces and offers to us. If we don't collaborate in the sense of be informed about it, taking it serious, or maybe work with that or work against it or criticize it. So a form of collaboration can also be activist in a critical sense. If we don't collaborate, first of all, someone else is going to do it. And second, we will not have enough to say to the developments that we are observing, because these developments include now massively and increasingly artificial intelligence things. This is not just one kind of object, but it's a lot of objects. You see that in education, sifting into practice, not just into the science, but into practice and in other areas. So indeed, there are sometimes macro level, transdisciplinary, I should say, epistemic and transdisciplinary changes that occur because of certain developments in the sciences, not developments in practice in this case, but in technoscience itself, that are being loved in the sciences themselves. And I use the term love in terms of charged with positive emotions. without capitalism being the culprit for the sort of efficiencies that are then created. But they love it and they do it, and they do it together. And I just wanted to throw that into the discussion.
Yeah, I would like to add some remarks on pragmatism, on early 20th century pragmatism, John Dewey, but there are also related figures in pragmatism important to the sociology of knowledge, like Karl Mannheim. Because I think there's something quite specific to the experimentalism that Tanja returns to and activates as a source of inspiration in this book. Now, what is particular about the experiments or the experimental mode of inquiry that you find in the work of people like John Dewey? Well, one of the key things for me has always been the way in which experimental inquiry is made central to politics, as well as to science and everyday life in that early 20th century pragmatism. Now, that's of course, it means then that we're talking not only about science as a knowledge practice that has society as a context or interlocutor. We're also very much talking about a context of industrialization where science and technology present a mode of intervention in the world that generates and has produced particular types of problems. So in that sense, I think the connection with ecological crisis and social crisis is not a general one. It's a very specific one in that Deweyan sense of the indirect consequences of action in a society that includes science and technology. And one of the key differences for me between how I've approached that shall we say, situation in my own work and the way that Tanja approaches it, is that Tanja very much emphasizes cooperation and collaboration. So for me, what is key about these experiments in society that generate new kinds of problems for society is that these experimental situations generate societal division. So Tanja speaks of nuclear power plants as one of her exemplary cases. In my own work, I'm working on smart mobility technologies and automated vehicles as a test case. And you see that these kind of developments and the creation of experimental situations in society as a consequence of science and technology, that they are profoundly antagonizing. They generate societal division between groups that are for and against, interests that are strengthened and interests that are threatened. And so what I am sort of struggling with, again, in a positive sense in reading Tanja's book, is how collaboration offers a viable mode in that context, where the role of science and technology in the world is in many ways antagonizing. I don't think that Tanja has a naive view of cooperation in her book. So she very much recognizes that the violence and disruption that everyday actors face, and that cooperation can be a response to such situations too. And just to conclude this and link it back to pragmatism, I was recently in conversation with Antoine Aignan, French actor network theorists, and he made comments to the effect that what we're facing today is very much a condition of the unmaking of the technological societies of the 20th century. So the type of technological societies that were enabled in Europe by a strong welfare state, investment in the public sector. And we're now, at least in countries like Britain, but also countries like the Netherlands, I think, in a quite different situation of the unmaking of that kind of experimental society that is grounded in a public sector. So, and that again then raises the question, is the kind of progressivist optimism that we find in the work of people like John Dewey, is that really is that the appropriate guide for the type of challenges that we face today?
Yeah, thanks again, all the three of you for these really inspiring comments. I think that maybe I start with Noortje, and then I come back to Karin and Hans-Jörg Rheinberger. Because I think Noortje's question on the idea of antagonism between different modes of apprehending the pragmatist legacy is, of course, on the one hand quite obvious, and I try to also, as Noortje said, to show that the current dynamics in the world society, so as I showed in the third chapter of my book, I try to show that, for instance, from social crisis situations, of course, there could arise, on the one hand, they could provoke either crisis, violence, and so on, and social divide, or social cooperation. So why I am so much stressing on the, let's say, optimistic part of, or I would call it maybe a methodological optimism, not so much a political, but maybe more a methodological optimism, is that I think we need, as I said in my introduction, we need more knowledge on that. And that my hope is that if we have more knowledge on the conditions which enable to sort from crisis situations, not with more disparity and more violence, etc., but to establish social coherence, is that our knowledge on the conditions to do that is still quite weak. And so in this sense, I also think that collaboration, as Karin Knorr Cetina developed in her comment on the question on that, for instance, within the sciences, there are attempts or practices, of course, of collaboration across epistemological silos, across epistemological practices, or as Hans-Jörg Rheinberger said, maybe we have even reached a situation where many advanced sciences know that they can't even survive without collaboration. I think this is the case for many sciences, though not all sciences have really understood that as a matter of fact, that this challenge or need for collaboration is something which, as Noortje said, which is not something like we take everyone by the hands and question of power within the social organization of knowledge or social organization of higher education, etc. funding, of political decisions for which kind of research should be streamlined and which not. So I think that also in my own field of research, which is marine sciences currently, most of natural scientists and even those who think that experiments are really something to solve just the problem, know at least strategically that they have to, in earlier or later, collaborate with the social sciences, because their research is not really apprehended by society as it should. So I think that by stressing on this kind and really maybe provoking even this kind of perspective that collaboration is needed, that we need more knowledge on the conditions how to enhance these kinds of practices within science and beyond the sciences, of course, is also maybe that what Noortje calls a kind of political part or activist part of the experimentalism I would foreground in the big heritage, within the big heritage of pragmatism in general. And of course, it's important also to stress, or maybe I just add something add a note on Hans-Jörg Rheinberger's proposition to quit experimentalism as an expression or as as an approach as such. Well, I think maybe there were different strands, of course, and I try to be brief so that we have a bit, yes, that we have also the possibility for the audience to intervene. But maybe just two comments on that. The one thing is that I hoped to construct, so to speak, an experimentalism as an experience-based and evolutionary theory, which is flexible enough to be not the same ism as we know the isms in general. And maybe another one was that most of the isms I know have been constructed by men, and I wanted as a woman also to create something like that. But that's more like a funny part of the answer. So thank you all very much. I took a lot of notes, and I'm sorry that I couldn't really go more into detail by answering everything. I hope we can stay in touch, and now I think it would be a nice moment to open the floor to comments from the audience.
Hi. So we don't have a lot of questions, but so there's a question from Stefan John, specifically to you, Tanja. It says, Dr. Bogusz, you mentioned that sociology should be more directed to the inquiry, to points where the question is not settled in the first place, and use the term real-world experiment several times. Could you give your thoughts to the rise and hype of living labs or Real Labore, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in German, that could potentially fulfill this thought in a collaborative way?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that the rise of real laboratories is also a kind of reaction on the one hand on the crisis we discussed here in the panel, but also the attempt that there might be, the idea that social problems, so to speak, could be faced through certain practices, through the enablement, as I said in the beginning, maybe also through infrastructural devices that could help people to interact and to communicate, etc., etc. There's a lot of debate, of course, about the impact of such real laboratories. For instance, in the coastal framework where I'm working in currently, there's a lot of discussion on how, for instance, different modes of knowledge, such as marine scientific knowledge, sociological or social scientific knowledge, stakeholder issues, issues coming from people living by the coast, etc., and what we could call target conflicts within the sustainability discussion, how all these different and really heterogeneous attempts could be brought together on a more or less symmetrical level, and so on. And I think it's well, up to date, I couldn't really name the one and only real laboratory which could figure really as a great example. But I think real laboratories are good working, or could be working best when the problem is not settled by one of the different parties which are involved in the real laboratory. But the one important issue, and this I could link back again to the idea of evolutionary knowledge, which is then linked also to democratic procedures, is that the settlement of a problem also determines its modes of solving the problem. And if different actors are not involved in the definition of the problem, this kind of collaboration will not really work, I think. So maybe that's my answer to this.
Right. And then there's another question about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which was discussed a bit, but in any case, if somebody wants to add something to this. So Diogo Pereira Henriquez has asked for an explanation on the Chernobyl nuclear disaster and the experimentalization of the world. So he says, could you explain a bit more about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster and the experimentalization of the world?
Oh yeah, that's because the question if society has become a real world, or not a real world in this case, but if society has become a laboratory, is a quotation from Johannes Weyer and Wolfgang Krohn, who published 1989 a very famous paper on entitled by this question, which was written through the impression of the Chernobyl disaster, and also within the whole discussion of risk society, which was raised by Ulrich Beck. And so the idea in this time, during this period, was, or what I wanted in the book, I explained that more broadly, is that this idea of society as a laboratory was much more framed through the impression of a huge disaster, of a crisis situation. So technical developments, technical devices could create enormous disasters to humanity. And so experimentalism in this sense, or societies are always sort of exposed to potential experiments which could then lead to catastrophes. And so this was just one framing how real world or real laboratories could be or have been discussed within sociology. And I just wanted to mention that even the idea of real world laboratories has evolved a lot. When we speak about Chernobyl, it's not the same as speaking about social ecological real laboratories today.
Right. So that was it from the audience. would any of the speakers, okay, so now we have another question right now. It says, so Tibebutai is saying, could experimentalism as a conspiracy theory be used to justify disasters such as COVID-19? I don't know what that means.
Conspiracy theory, that's wow. Well, I don't think it's about conspiracy, but of course the COVID-19 and in general the question of global health is very, very interesting regarding the question of experimentalism with Frédéric Keck, who is luckily also present here and who is an expert in epidemic and pandemic research from the anthropological perspective. I have discussed this, of course, which, well, on the one hand, for many, and this was also one reason why I raised again the idea of this real laboratory, let's say metaphor or topos, was that during the pandemic, you could read in the journals very often this kind of link to we are living in a social experiment, or world is undergoing a huge social experiment, because we experienced really in the Deweyan sense and also in the Marist sense a huge testing situation which demanded from politicians, practices, medicines, and yeah, everyone to act in the unknown, right? So this was really the situation Hans-Jörg Rheinberger gave as the definition of the experiment, to act into the unknown without really knowing what would be the result if this or that action will lead to better situation concerning the pandemic and the virus, etc. The risk of political upheaval, which was also so. And in this sense, of course, the pandemic was a very interesting case for sociological experimentalism, because not only because it had this kind of exposure of unsettling and testing and unknown, but also because we could observe how the different strata of society were exactly experimenting with different modes of trying to find to define the sub problems which were caused by the pandemic, also the reasons for the pandemic, and then to find solutions, or at least ways to live with or against the virus.
Right. Thank you for the explanations. Do any of the speakers have anything to add to these comments?
Just one remark, if it's possible. I think we could refer, or we should refer back to a very interesting book written by Michel Serres on that instead of having in its title a social contract, it has in its title the natural contract. And the thrust of the whole argument is that what our societies have been doing over the past century is to create world objects. That is, objects that are able to have an impact on the planet as a whole. And that is nuclear energy, for space. It would be instantaneous communication. It would be the internet, of course. And so you can imagine a number of other so-called world objects. And the pandemic that we have had is a biological world object that is being created through globalization processes over the 20th century. And these objects are themselves new objects that have to be investigated in order to deal with them. We need to have more knowledge about them. And that is why the sciences, in a way, also are in a process of undergoing such a deep change today. So, short remark.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really helpful way or insightful way of putting it, because I think it, and I'll also keep it very brief, I think it gets to the difference between reflexivity and experimentalism. Because of course, for Ulrich Beck and his Risk Society, Chernobyl was the exemplary case, the case that showed that there was no longer an outside, that society and nature now inhabited somehow the same sphere. And I think both Tanja's comments on crisis and now Hans-Jörg Rheinberger's comments on the world object, I think they show very well that an experimental sociology is different from a must be different from a reflexive sociology, because the reflexive sociology is still very much focused on the sort of coming into awareness of risk, or the entry into discourse of risk. But I think when we speak of this kind of, transformation of the order of the world object, there's a kind of an existential, like a transformation of the world on an existential plane that becomes so crucial, and so I know that it creates a kind of a messy it's a risk of doing messy theory when one acknowledges these kind of ontological dynamics, but I think it's really important that it gets brought within the discussion of sociological theory. So thank you for that.
May I just add a last thing, because I think it's really important what you said, to make really this difference between reflexivity and this kind of experimental perspective, because indeed I think maybe it wasn't clear enough, but I think sociology, and this was also what Karin stressed so much by pointing out that laboratory studies were in a sort of war against established philosophical and also sociological ideas of knowledge. That is exactly the idea that practicing epistemic objects is something which is not alone about a cognitive practice or about reflection or consciousness or things like that, but it's really about the very existence of things and materialities and so on, and that's so thanks a lot. This really made it clear, more clear than before. So maybe this wraps up quite nicely our discussion. Thanks you all very much. I'm really delighted. I was very delighted to have you here and to have all your intriguing perspectives on my work. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to add to that as well. It's been wonderful to have this discussion. It's been very insightful, and I'm sure the participants liked it a lot too. So again, thanks a lot to our participants as well for joining us today, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.